Well, it's going to be recorded, so this is something we can talk about in the chat a lot too, because obviously Manson is a pretty controversial figure, so there's a lot of things we can go over. But let's begin. So Charles Manson was basically a street kid when he was growing up. He grew up in really rough conditions, and he faced a lot of trials and tribulations which gave him this intense awareness of the gaps in society. He started to recognize all of the areas where there was corruption, there was inconsistency, and a lack of sustainability. And it was this lack of sustainability that really impacted Manson because he saw in American culture this empire of cards. And he knew that at any point in time, the whole thing could just collapse because the values that American culture were built upon are the Abrahamic values. America is a Protestant nation, first and foremost. And elements like the Protestant work ethic and the Protestant slave morality are ingrained in the culture, and those elements are the backbone of the system. But Manson saw that things were changing, and as he became an adult, he recognized that there was this growing pessimism within the United States. And within this growing pessimism, he found pockets of positive culture. Now, Manson is associated with the hippie movement in our contemporary culture, and when people look back at Manson, they think he's just like a long-haired hippie. And but the problem with that is that Manson wasn't depicted that way or didn't um, express any connection with that culture outside of the mainstream narrative and the way that he was presented to the public through the media. In reality, Manson was basically a survivalist, and he had a lot more in common with the Ted Kaczynski type um, anarcho primitivists that we see today than the typical hippies of the 60s. But he was slotted in with that movement because basically anyone who expressed ideas outside of the mainstream culture at the time, anyone who looked a little strange, and also the fact that he was hanging out in San Francisco and he was into rock and roll music and stuff like that, into the Beatles and the Beach Boys. Um, Manson was easy to slot in with the hippies, but Manson was operating on a whole nother level. So Charles Manson was essentially a black magician, and his goal with his magic practice was to achieve imminent power. He wanted to remove himself from the crumbling system that he had identified. Specifically, he felt that, as I said, the culture was rotting, but also the economic system was falling apart, the ecological system was falling apart, and race relations were falling apart. Now, the issue of race is very important here because Manson recognized that a great karmic debt had been accumulated by the United States because the Americans had taken Africans away from their homeland and brought them to America to be put into slavery. And so Manson would make comments and he'd say something like, You know, why would you remove the African man from Africa? He was a god in Africa, and he's a slave here. And so the whole idea was that Manson recognized that different people will thrive in different environments that are in alignment with their nature. And he saw that Africans, when they were in Africa, were allowed to have their gods. They were allowed to express their will, and they were allowed to achieve the type of freedom and liberation that he sought for himself. But he couldn't find that type of liberation in the American culture because he did not resonate with the Protestant work ethic. He did not resonate with the Protestant slave morality. He wanted something more. And so he started to accumulate followers. Manson was very charismatic. In terms of his rooted consciousness, he was rooted in the Anahata, and he was a very strong, immanent Anahata. So he had a natural magnetism to him. And some Anahata types are sort of born to be leaders. And Manson was definitely one of those types. So he was able to gain a following quickly, and his message resonated very strongly with young people who were becoming disenfranchised with the system. They didn't want to have anything to do with the capitalist system, and they felt that the United States had become sort of like one giant prison system. So Manson offered these people a way out, a way to escape the prison system. And eventually, he moved all of his followers out to a ranch far away from civilization, out in the desert. And they were preparing for the collapse of American society. They believed that this collapse was inevitable. But they also believed that the faster they could bring about the collapse, the better they could position themselves to attain power within our present order. Now, at that time, Manson spoke a bit about magic concepts and witchcraft to his followers, but just a bit. It wasn't overt. The occulted aspects of his practices did not become evident until much later, after he was arrested and was imprisoned. So we're going to talk about that in a moment. But for now, I just want to give kind of a recounting of the Manson killings and the aftermath and what led up to those killings. So Manson um, was sort of like a channeler in that he was channeling messages through music, um, but he wasn't doing it in the traditional channeling sense. What he was doing was he was taking messages that he found in music and he was presenting it in a very poetic and esoteric way in order to demonstrate his ideas. So, the strongest example of this is the concept of helter skelter. Helter Skelter is a song by the Beatles that Manson took and utilized as a platform for expressing his concept of attaining power through a dark age or a collapse of civilization. Now, if you think about it, if you listen to Helter Skelter, there's this theme of climbing up to the top of the slide and then dropping down. And it's a cyclical process, going up the slide and back down. Now, the way that Manson presented this song and its message to his followers was very much indicative of a yogic cycle. He was basically saying that civilizations rise and fall, and it's cyclical and it's inevitable. And so if you find yourself in the point just before the fall, and you're able to position yourself effectively before the fall, then you can be a king in the new age. And so Manson saw this new dark age forming. And this was an American Dark Age, a fall of the American civilization. And so he wanted to be on top, and he wanted to create a new order for his followers. And he was very much interested in advancing the will of his followers. Specifically, he had a cult of very dedicated female followers who essentially are a modern manifestation of a Maenad cult. The Maenads being the Dionysian women who, in ecstasy rebellion against the solar aspect, will go into a lycanthropic state and express their will in honor of Dionysus. So Manson had that kind of effect on these women. They were willing to give themselves to him, to his cause, because they believed in his cause, and they believed that he would offer them the type of liberation they were so deeply seeking. So, some of these women were like upper middle class women who were just really unhappy about being stuck within the system. And they were willing to abandon everything and go move out to the desert with Manson and his family, so that they had a prospect of achieving that kind of freedom that they were seeking. And he really did offer freedom to his followers. They were, for the most part, if you listen to the stories of the Manson women who didn't develop some type of resentment, or found some pathway to escaping the shadow of Manson by criticizing him, his followers remained very dedicated even after his imprisonment. And that is because he stuck to his word in offering them liberation. Now, Helter Skelter, as was presented by Manson, was sorry, what was that? Oh, never mind. Never mind. um, Helter Skelter, as presented by Manson, was a plan for creating a race war in the United States and leading to the destruction of white civilization, because Manson believed that white people had become so decadent in the United States and so weak due to their adherence to the Protestant system that if he could inflame a race war, they would be wiped out completely. And Manson and his family would hide out during this time. Now, Manson was not really a white supremacist, but he was like definitely a racist. And he believed that um, blacks needed to have some kind of framework, some kind of structure for them to exist within civilization. That he believed that they would not create that framework on their own and they wouldn't be able to operate that framework. So his idea was that he was going to hide out with his personal army, essentially. And after this race war that would lead to the extermination of whites in America, Manson would come out, rise to power, and he would direct this new America. It was a very apocalyptic vision, and there's questions as to whether or not Manson was even really serious about this, or if he was just applying some chaos magic approach in order to create as much disruption of the system as possible. Because the one thing that is certain is that Manson was very, very anti system. And he was very much opposed to the continuation of the American power structure. So, in order to achieve Helter Skelter, Manson, and there's obviously continued controversy over this, but Manson may or may not have directed certain members of his family to commit murders. Specifically, there is the murder of Sharon Tate, which I'm sure all of you have heard of. And this was a very, very vicious murder Sharon Tate was pregnant when she was murdered. Um, the followers of Manson, when they conducted this killing, they used the blood of their victims to put messages on the walls of the house that would indicate that this killing was actually perpetrated by radical blacks in the area, because they believed that once this would be seen, once this would be shown in the media, that it would cause such a stir that it would kick off the race war that would lead to Helter Skelter. Now, it's important to understand that at this time in American history, this type of grisly attack wasn't common, and nowadays people are murdered all the time in this country, and it's just something the American people have gotten used to. But at that time, it was really incredibly shocking. And so, with this murder, um, there was basically a death of the hippie movement, a death of the optimism within the counterculture. Because Manson was, after he was arrested and tried and convicted for this, he was used by the system as a means of undermining any type of counterculture activity and making the hippie movement look like something really dangerous and really scary. And of course, there was no race war. So Manson's plan did not come to fruition. But that wasn't the end for Manson, because Manson continued his activities while he was in prison. Now, most people are quite aware of everything that Manson was involved in prior to his attempt to bring about Helter Skelter. What most people are not aware of is all of the really deep occult activity that Manson involved himself in after this time period while he was in prison. First, it's important to note that Manson had some pretty strange communications while he was in prison with different figures and involvement with different organizations. Specifically, Manson was sort of like a proxy guru to James Mason. James Mason, the famous white supremacist, founded the Universal Order, which was a satanic, occult, neo National Socialist organization that took its name and symbol from Charles Manson, because James Mason was in contact with Charles Manson, and Manson gave him the idea for the name of the organization, his symbol, and gave him some instruction on how he should proceed with his organization. Now, the Universal Order is not something that Manson was heavily involved in. He did name the organization and he gave a little bit of direction to Mason, but there's a question as to whether or not Manson was just using James Mason for fun. And I think he was. I think that Charles Manson was not really serious about his interactions with James Mason. He thought, okay, this is just a guy that I can use to create more chaos. Because ultimately, that's what Charles Manson was all about. Manson is a shadow figure. He was a black magician in the purest sense, in that he sought to rebel against the solar order. And he was willing to do that by any means necessary, because Manson was a non dualist. He existed beyond good and evil. This is from a letter that Charles Manson wrote to Marilyn Manson. In the letter, Charles Manson said, "It's a far out balance, beyond good and bad, right, wrong." And this is a concept that's very important to understand when you're talking about Charles Manson, because this is something he always comes back to. It's the idea that there is no such thing as good or evil. Charles Manson exists beyond good and evil. And because of that, he's able to do something like, allegedly order the killing of Sharon Tate and her unborn child if he knows that it is serving the wider purpose of realizing his dharma or some dharmic expression that is of a social significance, of a transformation of the social order. So, Manson was very, very interested in this idea of non duality and creating balance between the dark and the light. And this is interesting considering that he was rooted in the Anahata, which is the point of balance between the divine masculine and the divine feminine. Now, his interest in this aspect of occult practice, creating balance, culminated in his integration of the deity Abraxas. Abraxas is an ancient deity that is depicted with serpent legs and a rooster head. And Abraxas is associated with balance. He is a non dualistic figure. So the idea behind Abraxas is that when you integrate the serpent aspect of his legs, which is Shakti, with the rooster or bird or eagle, these are all figures associated with Sahasrara, the crown. When you integrate that Shiva aspect with the Shakti aspect, you achieve transcendence. Transcendence beyond duality, a realization of non duality and to exist beyond good and evil. So you'll remember from my talk about Nietzsche, Nietzsche was also very interested in this concept of achieving some balance between the light and the dark and then transcending good and evil. So in a way, you can say that Manson is a very Nietzschean figure. So Manson went as far as to um, take on the name Abraxas. He released an album where he referred to himself as Abraxas, and he promoted the worship of Abraxas. There are Abraxas cults now, which formed out of a combination of the influence of Charles Manson and Anton LaVey. Because the Church of Satan spawned many splinter organizations. And one of these organizations was the Temple of Set, which members of the Temple of Set would later go on to promote Abraxas worship. And a former member of the Church of Satan, Boyd Rice, a very prominent member, a man who was actually in line to take over the Church of Satan before Anton LaVey died, he is a very prominent supporter of Charles Manson and a proponent of Abraxas worship. So the Abraxas cult is very strong now, especially within satanic currents, and it is deeply oriented towards the idea of achieving balance. Now, what do they mean by balance? Well, we exist in a solar culture, and within that solar culture, the Abrahamic system reigns supreme. So the idea of Abraxas worship is that you're trying to achieve balance between the light and the dark. And you do so through the application of a counterbalance. So if you're existing in an Abrahamic system, what is the counterbalance? Well, it is Lucifer. And so we see in Charles Manson's song that he dedicated to Abraxas a lot of really interesting occult ideas. So I'm going to go section by section through this song and discuss what Charles Manson is touching upon in terms of the esoteric significance of his music and of his ideas in general. In the first line he says, "O Lucifer, my light, your heart's been pierced and it bleeds in my night." So, he's immediately invoking Lucifer, Lucifer being the counterbalance to Yahweh. He's saying that Lucifer is his guiding light. The heart of Lucifer has been pierced. So the heart represents the will. And so Lucifer's will was attacked by Yahweh. He was placed in this restrictive element. Manson resonates with this because he himself felt great restriction within the Abrahamic system. He resonated with Lucifer because Lucifer represents that struggle, that will to express one's power and drive towards liberation within this prison system. That's why he says that it bleeds in his night. So he understands the pain that Lucifer feels. Then he says, Lucifer, rise in my mind, see all in splendor, perfection on the wind. He's asking Lucifer to rise to the point of contemplation. So Lucifer is an active figure, he's an immanent figure, but he's trying to integrate Lucifer into all aspects of the self. And when he can do that, when he says see all in splendor, he's saying that his integration of the Luciferian aspect is giving him the ability to see every aspect of consciousness and understand everything that is occurring within his surroundings so that he can act appropriately. That is the perfection on the wind. He goes on to say, down in the fires at night, in my mountain man, keep on brave, coming from the grave. So, this is discussing some aspects of his willingness to take action to separate himself from the wider culture. And this is a brave act because it takes a lot of guts to place yourself against such a powerful system. To come from the grave is to go down the descending path and rise again with power, which is what he is achieving. O children of darkness, shadows on the wall, I keep seeing you. So this is Manson's recognition that there are others who are walking this path. This is a left-hand path movement that he is forming, an immanent movement, expression of the will, expression of the ego. And so he sees that there are other children of darkness, and he's trying to reach out to them. This is his attempt to expand the influence, widen the family. In the nights, oh, what I see that you could be, within the days, oh, my darling, in the days of another dream. So this is the fact that Manson is showing an optimism. In the destruction that occurs through the application of the counterbalance, there is a potential for a new order to rise. This is the days of another dream. This is his willingness to always remain dedicated to the application of his will in the attainment of a new dharmic order, a new Luciferian order. So, the Luciferian aspect of Manson is also integrated in his name. Manson emphasized the Son of Man concept. Man, Son, Son of Man. He would often compare himself to Jesus Christ. But Manson did this in a way to where he could represent himself as a shadow aspect of Christ. So he recognized Christ acting in rebellion, but in a solar aspect, whereas he acts in rebellion in a lunar aspect. He turns the entire thing on its head, and he becomes sort of like a demonic Mephistopheles type figure. And this is interesting because Christ is associated with the Anahata, Mephistopheles the Anahata, Abraxas the Anahata, Manson the Anahata. All of this is very heart-centered, very much about applying counterbalance, creating a new order through this counterbalance. And just as one final note here that I want to mention before we get to questions, I think it's interesting to consider Marilyn Manson. Marilyn Manson was very interested in Charles Manson, of course, because he named himself after Charles Manson and Marilyn Monroe. But if you think about Charles Manson as compared to Marilyn Manson is like a Svadhisthana of Charles Manson. He's really basing his entire artistic approach upon the occult practices of Charles Manson, because Charles Manson was trying to show the dichotomy between things in order to create a new world. So if you think about the name Marilyn Manson, it's a dichotomy. It's Marilyn Monroe, this beautiful figure that everybody loves, and then Charles Manson, this sort of like ugly, sinister figure, but they both are surrounded by violence. They're both surrounded by the decadence of American culture. They're both surrounded by the rotting system. Now, Marilyn Monroe was consumed by it, but Manson was not. Manson was never consumed by the system. He may have been in prison, but he was liberated, and he remained liberated until the end of his life. And that is the sign of a very, very powerful magician. Okay, any questions or comments?
Ride the Tiger Yoga offers renowned private instruction to students on the right-hand path and left-hand path. Private students are given access to weekly live lectures with extensive Q&A sessions. We are proud to announce that recordings of these lectures will now be made available on Patreon through a new $10 tier that also includes an ever-growing library of exclusive materials